Cassie sat cross-legged on her faded quilt, her fingers moving slowly over the small pile of currencies scattered on the bedspread. $7.42. It was a pathetic amount when you looked at it against the backdrop of the real world, but in the quiet of her bedroom, it represented everything she had. She needed 300. That was the cost of peace for her brother, the price of a full night's sleep for her parents. At 12 years old, she shouldn't have known the exact cost of medical equipment, but necessity forces you to grow up fast. She scooped the coins into her pocket, the metal cold against her leg, and stood up. The world outside was enormous and indifferent, but she couldn't afford to be small today. To understand why a 12-year-old girl would walk out the door with $7, believing she could save her family, you have to understand the house she was leaving. It wasn't a loud house, not in the way you might think. The noise was specific. It was the rhythmic thumping of her younger brother Leo rocking against the wall in the next room. It was the low, exhausted murmur of her parents in the kitchen, their voices tight with the kind of stress that doesn't have a solution. You know that sound, the sound of good people trying to solve a math problem where the numbers just don't add up. Leo was 8, and his world was often too bright, too loud, and too sharp. When the sensory overload hit, his body became a cage he couldn't escape. The doctors said a weighted pressure vest would help, a specific kind that hugged the torso and grounded the nervous system. It was a simple tool, really, just fabric and weights, but it cost $300, and right now, with her dad's hours cut and the rent climbing, $300 might as well have been $1 million. Cassie had watched her mother look at the brochure for the vest, tracing the picture with a longing that hurt to witness. She had seen her father rub his temples at the kitchen table, staring at bills that refused to shrink. For Cassie, the eldest daughter, this wasn't just an observation, it was a call to arms. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the observant child. You see the cracks in the foundation before anyone else does, and you feel responsible for filling them, even if you have nothing but your own small hands. She didn't want to be another thing her parents had to worry about. She didn't want to ask for new shoes or field trip money. She wanted to be the relief. She wanted to be the one thing in their lives that was easy, the child who didn't need anything, so that there was enough left over for the one who needed everything. The $7.42 in her pocket wasn't an allowance. It was an accumulation of months of silent choices. It was the ice cream truck she ignored when her friends ran toward it. It was the birthday money from a distant aunt she hadn't spent on stickers or candy. It was the quarters she found on the sidewalk and polished until they shined. Each coin was a moment of self-denial, a tiny brick in the wall of hope she was trying to build. She had spent weeks on her inventory, painting smooth river stones she found by the creek, decorating them with ladybugs and stars, hoping that someone, somewhere, would see value in them. To her, they weren't just rocks, they were artifacts of her patience. She believed that if she put love into an object, the world would feel it and pay for it. It was a naive strategy, born of a heart that hadn't yet been hardened by commerce. She knew, logically, that selling painted rocks probably wouldn't buy the vest. But hope isn't logical. It's a refusal to accept the ending of the story as it currently stands. She looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like a girl in a denim jacket that was slightly too short in the sleeves. But she took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of lemon polish and anxiety that permeated the hallway. She couldn't fix Leo's brain. She couldn't fix her dad's job. But she could try to fix this one thing. She could try to turn $7 into something more. It's a terrifying moment when a child realizes that the adults don't have it all under control. But there is power in it too. It's the moment agency begins. Cassie tightened her ponytail, picked up her shoebox of painted stones, and walked past the kitchen. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't want to explain where she was going. She just slipped out the front door, the heavy latch clicking shut behind her, sealing her decision. She was walking into a battle she was almost certainly going to lose, but she was willing to fight it anyway. And that, perhaps, is the bravest thing any of us can do. Cassie's plan was simple, beautiful, and completely flawed. She was heading to Miller's Park, the one with the big fountain where people walked their dogs and ate overpriced ice cream. In her mind, this was a marketplace of pure potential. She had done the math on a scrap of notebook paper the night before. If she sold 40 stones at $5 each, she would have $200. If she sold the smaller ones for $3, that filled the gap. It was a perfect equation. In the world of a 12-year-old, math is clean. It doesn't account for market saturation, consumer indifference, or the fact that most adults don't walk around with cash looking to buy river rocks painted with glitter glue. But you have to admire the product development. These weren't just rocks. She had spent weeks selecting them from the creek bed behind her school. She looked for the smooth ones, the ones that felt heavy and comforting in the palm, like a worry stone. She scrubbed them in the bathroom sink until the water ran clear. Then came the paint. She had used her own meager supplies, tiny tubes of acrylics that she squeezed out until the plastic was flat. She painted galaxies on the dark ones, swirling purples and blues with flecks of white for stars. She painted ladybugs on the round ones. She painted words like peace and breathe on the flat ones. She believed in the labor theory of value without knowing what it was. She thought that because she had sat at her desk for hours, her back aching, her tongue poking out in concentration as she detailed a butterfly wing, that the value was inherent. She thought the world could see the invisible hours attached to the object. She thought that when a stranger picked up a stone, they would feel the love she had poured into it, and that feeling would compel them to open their wallets. It is a sweet, heartbreaking innocence, the belief that effort is a currency that can be exchanged for goods. As she walked, the box dug into her hip, but she hardly felt it. She was too busy running the simulation of success in her mind. This is what keeps dreamers moving forward, the movie playing behind their eyes. In Cassie's movie, she would set up her little display on the park bench. People would stop. First one, then a crowd. They would ooh and ah. Look at the detail, they would say. This is exactly what I need for my desk, a businessman would declare. They would hand her crisp bills, smiling at her enterprising spirit. The best part of the fantasy was the end. She imagined walking back into her kitchen. Her mom would be at the stove, stirring something that stretched $1, her shoulders tight. Her dad would be at the table, head in hands. And Cassie would walk in, not as the child who needed dinner, but as the hero who brought the feast. She would dump the money on the table, a pile of 1s and 5s and 10s. For Leo, she would say. She imagined the shock on their faces, the tears, the way her dad would hug her and say, "You did this? You did this." The relief would wash through the house like a cool breeze, blowing away the tension. That moment, that imaginary moment, was the fuel in her engine. It made her steps faster. It made the $7 in her pocket feel like a seed rather than a pittance. She turned the corner onto Elm Street, the park coming into view. The trees were green and lush, the sound of children laughing drifting toward her. It looked like the perfect stage for her triumph. She adjusted her grip on the box. She had her sign, written in marker on a piece of cardboard. Hand-painted stones, $5, for my brother. She thought the sign was the closer. Who could say no to a sister helping her brother? She didn't understand yet that people say no to suffering every single day, mostly by pretending they don't see it. She didn't understand that "for my brother" might look like a scam to a cynical world, or just an uncomfortable reminder of need that people wanted to avoid on their Saturday afternoon walk. She was armed with nothing but good intentions and acrylic paint. She was walking into a collision with reality, unprotected and painfully hopeful. Her heart started to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the adrenaline of the gamble. She was betting everything, her pride, her hope, her time, on the idea that the world was kind. She crossed the street, the traffic light chirping, and stepped onto the grass. The park was busy. Perfect, she thought. Just perfect. She found an empty bench near the main path, took a deep breath that rattled slightly in her chest, and set her box down. It was time to open for business. She laid out the stones on a small towel she'd brought. The galaxy stone in the center, the ladybugs flanking it, the breathe stone right at the front. She sat down, smoothed her skirt, and put a smile on her face that she hoped looked professional. She was ready. She was absolutely, terrifyingly ready for the world to prove her right. But the wind picked up, blowing a stray wrapper across the path, and for a second, just a second, the park felt very big and she felt very, very small. But she pushed that thought away. The movie in her head was still playing, and in the movie, this was the part where she won. So she waited, eyes bright, watching the first potential customer approach. She didn't know it yet, but the distance between the movie in her head and the sidewalk in front of her was about to be measured in silence. She sat up straighter. Here we go, she thought. Just watch me. The first hour wasn't a tragedy. It was a slow, suffocating silence. Cassie sat on that bench, her back straight, her smile fixed in a way that started to make her cheeks ache after 20 minutes. She watched the parade of humanity pass her by, and she learned her first hard lesson about the adult world. Invisibility is the default state. People walked past in a blur of motion. She learned to read them by their shoes before she even saw their faces. The rhythmic slap of jogging sneakers meant they wouldn't stop. They were on a mission, their headphones sealing them in a private universe. The casual scuff of sandals usually meant a slower pace, perhaps a wandering eye, but mostly they were distracted by conversations, by phones, by the ice cream cones melting in their hands. Cassie would perk up every time a shadow fell across her little towel display. She would lift her chin, ready with the pitch she had rehearsed in the mirror. "Hi, would you like to buy a hand-painted stone?" But the shadows kept moving. Most people didn't even look down. They maneuvered around her the way water flows around a stone in a river, mindlessly, effortlessly avoiding the obstacle without acknowledging its existence. A few people did glance. They offered tight, polite smiles, the kind of smile you give to a stray dog you have no intention of feeding. It was a smile that said, "I see you. You are cute. Please do not ask me for anything." It is a specific type of agony to offer your heart to the world and have the world not even bother to reject it, but simply look right through it. The sun beat down on her neck. The breathe stone seemed to mock her as her own breathing grew shallow and tight. The galaxy stone, which had looked so magical in her bedroom lamplight, now just looked like a rock with glitter glue sitting on a towel in the dirt. Doubt is a creeping vine. It starts at the ankles and wraps around the throat. Cassie began to wonder if her sign was wrong. Maybe the letters were too small? Maybe $5 was too much. Then came the moment that turned the indifference into something sharper. A group of teenagers, maybe 4 or 5 years older than her, came sauntering down the path. They were loud, possessing that terrifying, effortless confidence of high schoolers who know they own the park. Cassie felt her stomach tighten. She instinctively wanted to cover her wares, to hide, but the desperate hope for a sale kept her frozen. One of the boys, wearing a jersey and carrying a basketball, stopped. He looked down at the towel. Cassie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her rib. "Check it out," he said, nudging the girl next to him. "Art." The girl looked down, popping her gum. She didn't look mean exactly. She just looked bored, which was somehow worse. "Cute," she said, in a voice that stripped the word of any compliment. $5, the boy read from the sign, his eyebrows shooting up. He crouched down, picking up the ladybug stone. He tossed it lightly in his hand, weighing it. "Hey kid, you know these are free, right? Like, the ground is full of them." The group laughed. It wasn't a villainous cackle. It was just a casual, dismissive sound. A sound that said her effort was a joke. It's hand-painted," Cassie managed to whisper, her voice trembling so much she hated herself for it. "For my brother." The boy put the rock back down, but not gently. He dropped it. It made a dull clack against the others. "Right. Good luck with that, entrepreneur." He stood up and they walked away, their laughter drifting back to her like smoke. $5 for a rock," she heard one of them say. "I should sell the dirt from my shoes." Cassie sat there, the heat rising in her face until she felt like she was burning alive. It wasn't just rejection, it was exposure. She realized with a crushing clarity that she looked ridiculous. She wasn't a savior. She wasn't a hero helping her family. She was a little girl sitting in the dirt with garbage, begging for money. The sign, "For my brother," suddenly felt exploitative and pathetic. She felt like she had taken the private, holy struggle of her family and turned it into a roadside sideshow that nobody wanted to see. The shame was physical. It made her hands shake as she reached out and snatched the stones up. She didn't stack them neatly this time. She threw them into the shoebox, the beautiful galaxy crashing into the ladybug, chipping the paint. She didn't care. She just wanted them gone. She wanted to be gone. She shoved the towel on top, hiding the evidence of her failure. She stood up, clutching the box to her chest like a shield. The park was still sunny. The fountain was still splashing. The world hadn't changed, but her place in it had. She had walked in feeling like a protagonist. She was walking out feeling like a nuisance. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the families walking by, terrified that they might see the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had $7.42 in her pocket and a box of worthless rocks in her arms, and she had never felt poorer in her entire life. Cassie turned away from the park, but she didn't head toward the main street. The main street was for people who had succeeded, for people carrying shopping bags and walking with their heads up. She took the long way, ducking into the alleyway that ran behind the library. It was a narrow, shadowed path paved with cracked asphalt and lined with overflowing dumpsters, but right now, the ugliness felt safer than the sunshine. The box of painted stones bumped rhythmically against her stomach with every step, a heavy, awkward reminder of her own foolishness. Each thud against her ribs felt like a reprimand. "Who did you think you were?" the voice in her head whispered. "You're just a kid with a paint set. You're not a business. You're not a savior." She stepped over a puddle of stagnant water, her sneakers scuffing against the grit. The shame was a physical heat radiating from her chest. It wasn't just the mockery of the teenagers that stung. It was the exposure of her own naivety. She had really believed that the world would pause for her good intentions. She had believed that because her cause was noble, because Leo's need was real, the universe would bend to help her. Walking down that alley, surrounded by the smell of damp cardboard and exhaust, she felt the crushing weight of a new truth. The world didn't care about the why. It only cared about the what. And what she had was a box of rocks. She thought about her parents. She imagined walking through the front door, the bell on the handle jingling, her mother looking up from the stove with that flicker of desperate hope she tried to hide. Cassie couldn't face that look. Not yet. She couldn't present them with her failure while the wound was still fresh. She needed a buffer. She emerged from the alley near the Daily Grind, a small coffee shop on the corner. It was a place for adults, people with laptops and meetings. Cassie hesitated at the glass door, seeing her own reflection, a small girl in a denim jacket clutching a shoebox. She looked out of place, but the wind was picking up, cutting through her clothes, and she just wanted to stop moving. She pushed the door open. The bell chimed, a cheerful sound that felt jarring against her mood. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the barista, and hurried to a small, wobbly table in the far back corner, tucked behind a large potted fern. She sat down, the wooden chair hard beneath her, and slid the box of stones under the table, hiding the evidence. She didn't buy anything. She couldn't. Spending even $1 of her savings felt like a betrayal of the effort it took to earn it. She just needed to exist somewhere quiet for a moment. Her hand went to her pocket, seeking the familiar comfort of the money. She pulled out the crumpled bills and the handful of coins, laying them out on the dark, varnished wood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ones, the quarters, the dimes, $7.42. She smoothed the wrinkles out of the bills with the pad of her thumb, over and over again. This was her ritual of control. In a world that felt too big and too expensive, these $7 were the only things she actually owned. She stared at the small pile until her vision blurred. The math remained stubborn. 7 was not 300. It wasn't even close. It was a drop of water trying to put out a forest fire. A deep, aching exhaustion settled into her bones, making her limbs feel heavy, as if gravity had suddenly doubled its pull on her specific chair. Her throat felt tight, the stinging precursor to tears pricking at her eyes. She fought them back. She wouldn't cry here. She wouldn't let these strangers see her break. She felt a profound desire to simply disappear, to fold into herself until she was nothing but a speck of dust floating in the coffee-scented air. She closed her eyes, her hand resting protectively over her meager pile of cash, trying to breathe through the tightness in her chest. She was alone. She was small, and she had failed. Then the light changed. The warmth of the sunbeam that had been hitting her table suddenly vanished. A shadow fell over her, stretching across the wood, covering her money in darkness. It interrupted her isolation, breaking the bubble of her despair. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't look up immediately. She braced herself, expecting the barista, expecting to be told that tables were for paying customers only. She swallowed the lump in her throat and slowly lifted her head, preparing to apologize, preparing to be kicked out of one more place. The shadow belonged to a man who looked like he had been carved out of something harder than flesh and bone. He wasn't the barista coming to chase her away for loitering. This man was different. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with architectural precision, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone for efficiency. He held a leather laptop case in one hand and a black coffee in the other. He looked like he was there because he needed caffeine to fuel a machine that never stopped running. His eyes were the most unsettling part. They were gray, sharp, and completely devoid of the soft, pitying glaze she had seen on the faces of the few adults who had glanced at her in the park. He wasn't looking at her like she was a sad little girl. He was looking at the table like it was a spreadsheet that didn't balance. He looked at the crumpled bills. He looked at the coins. Then, his gaze dropped to the shoebox she had tried to kick deeper into the shadows under the table. Cassie's hand instinctively curled over her money, a protective claw. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of shame. She waited for the words she knew were coming. "You can't sit here," or "Are you lost?" or, the worst one, "Where are your parents?" Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the shoebox. "Bad quarter?" he asked. His voice was deep, dry, and startlingly direct. It was the voice you used when asking a colleague for a status report. Cassie blinked, the unexpectedness of the question knocking the wind out of her defensive crouch. "What?" "The box," he said, gesturing with his coffee cup, "and the cash flow situation on the table. You look like a business that just had a very bad quarter." Cassie felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, hotter than the shame from the park. This felt different. It felt like he was seeing through the denim jacket and the ponytail, right to the failure she was trying to hide. "I'm not a business," she snapped, the words coming out sharper than she intended. I'm leaving." She started to scoop the coins toward the edge of the table, her fingers fumbling in her haste. She needed to get out. She couldn't handle this man's laser-focused attention. He was dissecting her misery, and she didn't have the energy to be a specimen. "I didn't ask you to leave," he said, his tone remaining perfectly level. "I asked about the data. You walked in here, you went straight to the corner, you didn't buy anything, and you've counted that $7.42 4 times in the last 6 minutes. The math isn't going to change just because you look at it harder." Cassie froze. He had been watching her? The realization made her stomach turn. She felt exposed. "It's none of your business," she whispered, clutching the money in her fist. "Liquidity is everyone's business," he countered. He didn't move away. Instead, he did the last thing she expected. He pulled out the chair opposite her, the wood scraping loudly against the floor, a sound that made half the coffee shop look up, and sat down. He placed his laptop bag on the floor and set his coffee on the table, right next to her invisible boundary line. Cassie stared at him, wide-eyed. "What are you doing?" "My name is William," he said, ignoring the question. He looked at her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "And I'm sitting here because I'm curious. I see a lot of people in this city giving up. I see people walking around with their shoulders slumped, accepting whatever scraps the world throws at them. But you," he pointed a long finger at the shoebox under the table, "you're carrying inventory, which means you tried to do something, and judging by the look on your face, it didn't work. So, I want to know why." Cassie's mouth opened and closed. She was ready for pity. She was ready for cruelty. She was not ready for this cold, analytical curiosity. He wasn't offering to buy her a hot chocolate or give her money. He was looking at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve before his next meeting. "It's just rocks," she mumbled, looking down at the table. "It's stupid." "The market decides what's stupid," William said, leaning forward, invading her space. "Not you. Now put the box on the table." "No, put the box on the table," he repeated. It wasn't a command exactly. It was a challenge. Cassie looked at the door. It was 20 feet away. She could run, but something in William's gray eyes held her there. He wasn't mocking her. He was taking her seriously. And for a girl who had spent the last 3 hours being invisible, being taken seriously was a terrifying, addictive drug. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached under the table and lifted the shoebox. She set it down between them, the cardboard lid slightly askew. "Open it," William said. Cassie lifted the cardboard lid. To her eyes, the contents had transformed. An hour ago, they were treasures. Now, under the fluorescent lights of the coffee shop and the scrutiny of this stranger, they looked exactly like what they were, river stones covered in children's paint. The galaxy stone sat on top, its glitter slightly shedding onto the bottom of the box. She waited for the smirk. She waited for him to tell her that this was cute, that she should set up a lemonade stand instead. William didn't smirk. He reached into the box with a hand that looked like it signed checks for more money than her father made in a year, and he picked up the galaxy stone. He turned it over in his fingers, examining the weight, the texture, the brushstrokes. He didn't look like an art critic. He looked like a jeweler inspecting a diamond for flaws. "The execution is adequate," he said finally, placing the stone back in the box with a deliberate click. "The product is durable. The aesthetic is passable." He looked up, locking eyes with her. "So, why did you fail?" Cassie felt her face burn. "Because nobody wants rocks," she whispered. "Because I'm just a kid, and people don't care." "Wrong," William said. The word was sharp, cutting through her self-pity. "People buy useless things every day. They buy pet rocks, they buy plastic keychains, they buy bottled water when they have taps at home. The market is full of people buying things they don't need. He leaned back, crossing his arms. You failed because you're trying to sell a commodity in a market that doesn't value commodities. You're selling a rock. I can get a rock from the driveway. It's hand-painted, Cassie defended weakly. That's a feature, not a benefit, William countered. Why are you selling them? And don't tell me to make money. Money is a result, not a reason. Why do you need the capital? Cassie hesitated. This was the part she hated. This was the part where she had to admit that her family wasn't whole, that they were struggling, that they couldn't afford a simple medical device for her brother. It felt like opening a door to a messy room she had been taught to keep shut. But William was waiting, and his silence was heavy. My brother, she said, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the espresso machine. He has sensory issues. He needs a weighted vest to help him calm down. It costs $300. We don't have it. William's expression didn't soften, but it shifted. The calculation in his eyes changed variables. And did you tell the people in the park that? Cassie recoiled. No, I'm not a beggar. I wanted them to buy the rocks because they liked them. I wanted to earn it properly. And that, William said, leaning in until his face was inches from hers, is why you have $7 instead of $300. He tapped the table with his index finger, a rhythmic, emphatic beat. You are making a fundamental error. You think that business is about the object. You think dignity comes from the product, but you are selling the wrong thing. You're selling rocks, but you need to be sharing a story. Cassie frowned, confused. A story? Value is not inherent, Cassie, he said, using her name for the first time, though she hadn't told him what it was. He must have seen it written on the side of the shoebox. Value is perceived. When you sit there with a sign that says painted rocks $5, you are asking people to value the paint and the stone. They look at it, they do the math, and they decide it's not worth $5. But if you tell them the truth, if you tell them that this stone is a brick in the foundation of your brother's peace, you aren't selling a rock anymore. You are selling them a chance to be a hero. You are selling them a connection to something good. But that feels wrong. Cassie struggled to articulate the knot in her stomach. It feels like using him. It feels like asking for pity. It is not pity, William corrected firmly. It is vulnerability, and vulnerability is the most expensive currency in the world because so few people are brave enough to spend it. He gestured to the box. You are hiding the why because you think it makes you look weak. You think your struggle is a liability, but your struggle is your value. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. You are robbing them of the chance to care. Cassie sat back, stunned. She had spent the whole day trying to look professional, trying to look like she didn't need help, thinking that was what dignity looked like. William was telling her that her armor was actually a cage. He looked at his watch, then stood up abruptly. The lesson was over. He picked up his laptop bag. Cassie felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope. He understood. He was rich. He knew about the vest. Surely this was the part where he pulled out his wallet and fixed it. Her eyes darted to his hand, waiting for the cash. William saw the look. He paused, his hand hovering near his pocket. For a second, Cassie thought he was going to do it. Then, he put his hand back on his laptop bag. I could give you the money, he said, his voice dropping low. I have $300 in my wallet right now. It would mean nothing to me. Cassie's breath hitched. Please, she whispered. Please, it's for Leo. No, William said. The rejection hit her like a slap. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and sudden. Why? You said you understood. You said... I said I understand the value, William interrupted. If I give you the money, you get the vest. That solves the problem for today. But tomorrow, next month, when the next problem comes, you'll still be the girl who waits for a savior. You'll still think you're helpless. He looked down at her, and for the first time, his gray eyes held something that looked like respect. I am not going to rob you of your victory, Cassie. You have inventory, you have a market, and now you have the strategy. Go back to the park. But they laughed at me, she choked out. So let them laugh, William said, turning toward the door. You aren't there for them. You're there for Leo. Change the sign. Tell the truth. See what happens. He walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him, leaving Cassie alone with her box of rocks and a heart that was pounding with a terrifying new rhythm. He hadn't given her a cent. He had given her something much harder to carry, the responsibility to save herself. The bell above the door settled into silence, the sound of William's exit fading into the hum of the refrigerator and the low murmur of a conversation at the counter. Cassie was alone again. She stared at the empty chair where he had sat, the wood still slightly askew from his departure. Her first reaction wasn't gratitude. It was a hot, sticky anger that coated her throat. He had the money. He had said it himself. $300 was nothing to him. He could have pulled out a wallet, placed the bills on the table, and changed her entire life in 10 seconds. He could have ended the worry in her mother's eyes and the screaming in her brother's room. But he had chosen not to. He had chosen to give her a lecture on economics instead of a lifeline. It felt cruel, like someone tossing a swimming manual to a drowning girl instead of a rope. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to pack up her box, go home, and cry into her pillow until the world made sense again. But as the anger burned itself out, it left behind something colder and harder. The truth of what he had said. "You are hiding." The words echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her insecurity. She looked down at her shoebox. The galaxy stone, the ladybug, the breathe rock. They were pretty. They were safe. They were a shield she had built so that she wouldn't have to show anyone the messy, painful reality of her life. This is the internal war that happens when we are asked to be brave before we feel ready. It is the conflict between the desire for dignity and the necessity of help. Cassie had always thought dignity meant silence. She thought it meant standing tall, smiling politely, and never letting anyone see that you were struggling. That was how her parents did it. They never complained. They never asked the neighbors for loans. They just worked harder and slept less. She had inherited that code, written into her DNA like a survival instinct. To ask for help felt like admitting defeat. To tell a stranger about Leo's meltdowns felt like a betrayal of her family's privacy. But privacy wasn't buying the vest. Silence wasn't fixing the problem. She pulled the shoebox closer, her fingers tracing the rough edge of the cardboard. She thought about Leo. She thought about last Tuesday when the storm had come through and the thunder had been so loud it sent him into a spiral that lasted for 4 hours. She remembered the way he had clawed at his own skin, trying to escape the sensation of the noise, and how her mother had wrapped him in a heavy blanket, rocking him back and forth, tears streaming down her face because the blanket wasn't enough. The weight wasn't right. The pressure wasn't consistent. They needed the vest. That memory cut through her hesitation like a knife. William was right. She wasn't selling rocks. She was fighting for her brother's peace. If she had to bleed a little to get it, if she had to strip away her pride and stand naked in her vulnerability, then that was the price. And she had to be willing to pay it. She reached into her backpack, her hand trembling slightly, and pulled out the thick black marker she had used to make her first sign. She took the piece of cardboard that said, "Hand-painted stones, $5, and flipped it over. The blank side stared up at her, a gray slate waiting for a new truth. She uncapped the marker. The smell of the ink was sharp and chemical. She hesitated, the tip hovering over the cardboard. Writing it down made it real. Writing it down meant she couldn't take it back. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest, and she began to write. She didn't write, "For my brother." That was safe. That was vague. She wrote the truth. She wrote the words that explained the why. "My brother has autism. He needs a sensory vest to feel safe. Every dollar helps him sleep." The letters were stark and uneven against a gray background. She looked at them, and a wave of nausea rolled in her stomach. It felt like she was putting a secret diary on display. It felt terrifying. But as she stared at the words, the sign didn't look like begging anymore. It looked like a mission statement. She practiced what she would say. She whispered it to the empty coffee cup on the table. "Hi, I'm raising money for my brother." Her voice cracked. She tried again. "My brother needs help." No, that sounded desperate. She closed her eyes and pictured William's face, not the harshness, but the expectation. He had believed she could do it. "I'm selling these stones to buy a medical vest for my brother," she whispered. The words tasted foreign, heavy with a reality she usually tried to hide. "He has sensory processing disorder, and this will help him." It was the longest sentence she had ever planned to say to a stranger. It required her to trust that the stranger wouldn't laugh. It required her to trust that the world was capable of empathy. She looked at the clock on the wall. The afternoon was slipping away. If she went home now, she would be safe. She would still have her $7. She would still have her pride. But Leo would still have his bad nights. Cassie stood up. The chair scraped against the floor again, but this time she didn't flinch at the noise. She gathered her coins and bills, shoving them deep into her pocket. She put the lid back on the shoebox and tucked it under her arm. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a box of toys. It felt like a toolbox. She wasn't just a girl with a hobby anymore. She was a sister with a purpose. She walked toward the door, her reflection in the glass approaching her. A small figure in a denim jacket, pale and terrified, but moving forward. She pushed the door open, and the wind hit her face, colder than before. The walk back to the park would be the hardest walk of her life. She was returning to the scene of her humiliation, but she was bringing a new weapon. She was bringing the truth. And she was about to find out if the truth was enough. Returning to Miller's Park felt less like walking to a marketplace and more like stepping onto a stage where she had already forgotten her lines. The afternoon light had shifted, the shadows stretching longer and thinner across the grass, casting a golden, hazy quality over the playground. To anyone else, it was just a Saturday afternoon. To Cassie, it was the final round. She walked to the same bench she had occupied before, the scene of her earlier humiliation. It was empty now, a silent witness waiting for her return. Her legs felt heavy, not from fatigue, but from the sheer gravitational pull of her own fear. She set the box down. Her hands were trembling so badly that the stones clicked against each other, a nervous chatter that seemed too loud in the open air. She took out the towel and laid it flat. She arranged the stones, the galaxy, the ladybugs, the words of affirmation. Then came the moment of truth. She pulled out the cardboard sign. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Placing that sign on the bench felt like peeling off her own skin. It was an invitation for the world to look not just at her product, but at her pain. My brother has autism. He needs a sensory vest to feel safe. She propped it up against the back of the bench. There, it was done. The secret was out. She sat down, but she didn't smile this time. She couldn't fake the bright plastic cheerfulness of a salesperson anymore. She felt raw. She clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking and waited. The vulnerability was excruciating. Every glance from a passerby felt like a physical touch, a probing inquiry into her family's private struggles. She wanted to snatch the sign down. She wanted to run back to the safety of silence, but the image of Leo rocking back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut against a world that was too loud, kept her glued to the wood. 10 minutes passed, then 20. People walked by. Some glanced at the sign and looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the sudden intrusion of reality into their leisure time. It stung, but Cassie forced herself to breathe. "You aren't there for them," William had said. Then a woman approached. She was walking briskly, wearing a tailored coat and checking a smartphone, the universal posture of someone who does not want to be interrupted. She was exactly the kind of person Cassie would have let pass before, someone too busy, too important. But as the woman drew parallel to the bench, her eyes flicked down. She saw the stones. Then she saw the sign. Her steps slowed, just a fraction. Cassie's throat went dry. This was it. The old Cassie would have stayed silent or offered a generic hello. The new Cassie, the one fighting for her brother, had to speak. She had to bridge the gap. "Hi," Cassie said. Her voice was thin, cracking on the single syllable. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the volume up from her diaphragm. I'm selling these for my brother, Leo." The woman stopped. She lowered her phone, her expression unreadable behind oversized sunglasses. She looked at the sign, reading the black marker words. Then she looked at Cassie. "He has a hard time sleeping," Cassie continued, the words tumbling out in a rush now that the dam had broken. She wasn't reciting a script, she was just telling the truth. "The vest helps him feel grounded. It's like a hug that doesn't stop. We're saving up for it." She waited for the rejection. She waited for the woman to say, "That's nice, dear," and keep walking. She waited for the judgment that she was using a sob story to peddle rocks. But the woman didn't walk away. She slid her sunglasses up onto her head. She looked tired. Not the physical exhaustion of manual labor, but the deep, etched fatigue of someone who carries a mental load that never lightens. She looked at the galaxy stone, the one William had called passable. "A sensory vest," the woman said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a recognition. "My nephew has one. He calls it his armor." The air between them shifted instantly. The transaction was no longer about a painted rock and $5. It was a bridge built across the lonely expanse of human experience. Cassie felt a shock of connection that made her fingertips tingle. "Leo calls his blanket his shield," Cassie said, her eyes widening. "But the blanket falls off when he moves." The woman nodded slowly. She reached out and picked up the galaxy stone. She ran her thumb over the rough surface where the paint swirled into a nebula. She wasn't inspecting the quality of the art. She was holding the intention behind it. She was weighing the love of a sister against the weight of the stone. "You're a good sister," the woman said. Her voice was thick with an emotion Cassie hadn't expected to find in a stranger. "It's hard, isn't it? Watching them struggle." "Yes," Cassie whispered. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. "It's really hard." The woman opened her purse. She didn't dig for loose change. She pulled out a $20 bill. She placed it on the towel, right next to the sign. "I don't have change," Cassie panicked, reaching for her pocket. "I only have ones and—" "Keep it," the woman said firmly. She closed her fingers around the galaxy stone, holding it tight. "This isn't for the rock. It's for the armor. You tell Leo that he's got people rooting for him, okay?" Cassie stared at the $20 bill. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. It was 4 times the price she had asked for. She looked up at the woman, her vision blurring. "Thank you," she choked out. "Thank you so much." "No," the woman said, offering a small, sad smile. "Thank you for reminding me what matters." She walked away, the stone clutched in her hand like a talisman. Cassie sat there, the $20 crisp under her fingers. Her heart was still racing, but the rhythm had changed. It wasn't the frantic beat of fear anymore. It was the powerful, driving pulse of possibility. She had risked the truth, and the world hadn't destroyed her. It had answered. The first sale is always the hardest, because it requires a leap of faith. The second sale is different. It requires momentum. And momentum is exactly what Cassie found in the quiet aftermath of that woman's kindness. She sat there for a moment, the $20 bill tucked safely beneath the weight of her thigh, feeling the tectonic plates of her world shift. The fear that had been strangling her voice loosened its grip. She realized that she hadn't just sold a painted stone. She had sold a piece of her reality, and it had been received with grace. She sat up straighter. The slump in her shoulders, the defensive posture of a child expecting a blow, evaporated. When the next potential customer approached, a young couple walking a golden retriever, Cassie didn't wait for them to notice her. She didn't shrink back. She met their eyes. "Hi," she said. Her voice was steady this time, grounded. "I'm raising money for a sensory vest for my brother." The couple stopped. The dog wagged its tail, sniffing at the box. The young man read the sign, his eyebrows knitting together in sympathy. "Sensory vest? Is that for autism?" "Yes," Cassie said, and this time she smiled. Not the fake, plastered-on smile of a salesperson trying to be liked, but the genuine, relieved smile of a sister who was finally allowed to talk about the person she loved. "He has a hard time with loud noises. The vest helps him feel safe." The girl squeezed the man's hand. "That's really sweet. Which one is your favorite?" "The ladybug," Cassie said, pointing to a round red stone she had spent an hour detailing. "Because my brother loves bugs. He can watch them for hours." They bought the ladybug. They gave her $10 and told her to keep the change. As the afternoon wore on, the park transformed. It was no longer a landscape of indifference. It became a series of opportunities. Cassie learned quickly that William was right. The rocks were just the vehicle. The connection was the fuel. She spoke to a grandmother who bought the peace stone because she said she needed a little peace in her garden. She spoke to a teenager, not one of the mocking ones, but a quiet boy with headphones around his neck, who bought a blue swirl stone because he said it looked like the ocean and he missed the coast. It wasn't a perfect streak, of course. There were still people who walked by without looking. There were still people who read the sign and frowned, checking their watches as they hurried past the discomfort of a child's need. But the rejection felt different now. Before, every ignored glance had felt like a confirmation of her worthlessness. Now, it just felt like data. It was exactly as William had said. The market decides. And for every person who walked away, there was another who stopped, drawn in not by the product, but by the vulnerability of the sign. Cassie found a rhythm. She stopped trying to sell the object and started sharing the goal. "It's for Leo," she would say. "He's 8. He's really smart, but the world is too loud for him." People listened. They leaned in. They didn't just hand over money. They offered stories of their own. A man in a jogging suit told her about his nephew who had ADHD. A woman with a stroller told her about her own struggles with anxiety. The transaction became a two-way street of empathy. The painted stones became tokens of that shared moment, a physical reminder that for 1 minute on a Saturday afternoon, 2 strangers had cared about the same thing. The sun began to dip lower, casting long golden shadows across the grass. The air turned cooler, crisp with the promise of evening. Cassie's shoebox, once heavy with inventory, was growing lighter by the hour. but the weight was simply transferring. Her pockets were dragging down her jacket, bulging with crumpled bills and heavy coins. She didn't stop to count it yet. She was afraid to break the spell. She just kept going, her voice growing hoarse but her spirits soaring. She sold the breathe stone to a college student studying for finals. She sold a simple green rock to a toddler who just liked the color, his mother smiling as she handed over 5 ones. Finally, there was only one stone left. It was a jagged, uneven rock she almost hadn't brought, painted with a simple yellow sun. A man in work boots, looking exhausted and covered in dust from a construction site, stopped at the bench. He looked at the empty box, then at the single stone. He read the sign slowly, his lips moving. "My little girl has trouble sleeping too," he said, his voice rough. He dug into his pocket, pulling out a handful of change and a few crumpled bills. It clearly wasn't excess income for him. "Is this enough?" He held out $6. "It's perfect," Cassie said softly. She handed him the sun. "I hope she sleeps better tonight." "You too, kid," he said, tipping his hard hat. He walked away, and Cassie sat there, staring at the empty shoebox. The cardboard bottom was stained with a few flecks of glitter, but otherwise it was bare. She had done it. She had walked in with nothing but hope and paint, and she was walking out with, well, she didn't know how much yet. But she knew it was enough to matter. She began to pack up. She folded the towel, tucking it into the empty box. She took down the sign, the brave, honest sign that had changed everything. She held it for a moment, tracing the letters. "My brother." She stood up, the wind rustling through the trees. The park was emptying out, families heading home for dinner. Cassie felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but it was the good kind, the exhaustion of a runner who has crossed the finish line. She patted her pockets. They were full. She wasn't just a little girl who loved her brother anymore. She was someone who could provide for him. She was someone who could look the world in the eye and ask for what she needed. She turned toward home, the empty box tucked under her arm, walking into the sunset not as a victim of circumstance, but as the author of her own story. The walk home was a transformation. The pavement was the same cracked concrete, and the streetlights flickered on with their usual hum, but the girl walking beneath them had fundamentally changed. Cassie felt the weight of the coins and bills pressing against her thigh, a heavy, rhythmic reminder of her own agency. It wasn't just money, it was proof. She had left this house hours ago as a helpless observer of her family's struggle, a child armed with nothing but $7 and a naive hope. She was returning as a contributor, a lifeline. The shame that had burned her cheeks in the coffee shop was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering pride that straightened her spine. She reached her front porch and paused, looking through the window. The scene inside was a tableau of exhaustion. Her dad was at the kitchen table, head in his hands, staring at a stack of bills that never seemed to get smaller. Her mom was at the sink, her shoulders hunched in that permanent brace against bad news. The silence of the house drifted out to the street, heavy and suffocating. Cassie took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs, and opened the door. The air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken worry. Her dad looked up, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. "Cassie? We were getting worried. Where have you been?" "I went for a walk," she said. She didn't go to her room to hide. She walked straight to the kitchen table. She didn't say anything at first. She just started emptying her pockets. First came the crumpled bills, 1s, 5s, the crisp 20 from the woman in the coat. Then came the coins, cascading onto the cheap laminate table with a loud metallic clatter that sounded like rain after a drought. Her parents watched, stunned into silence as the pile grew. It was a chaotic, beautiful mound of currency, smelling of copper and strangers' hands. She emptied the last dime, the sound ringing like a bell. "Cassie," her mother whispered, wiping her wet hands on a dish towel. "What is this?" "It's for the vest," Cassie said. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady, grounded in the reality of what she had achieved. "I sold the rocks. I told people about Leo, and they wanted to help." Her father reached out, his rough hand touching a crumpled $5 bill as if it were a fragile artifact. He looked at the money, then up at his daughter. The look on his face wasn't just gratitude, it was a profound, dawning respect. He wasn't looking at a little girl who needed protecting anymore. He was looking at a partner in the struggle. They counted it together, their hands moving over the bills. $312. The relief that washed over the room was physical. It was as if the walls themselves exhaled. Her mother started to cry, not the stifled, hidden tears of late nights, but open, relieved tears. She pulled Cassie into a hug that squeezed the breath out of her. "You did this," she whispered into Cassie's hair. "You brave, brave girl." But the real victory wasn't the money. It was later that night when they sat around the old laptop and clicked order. It was the feeling of agency. The tracking number became the most exciting thing in the world. When the package finally arrived 3 days later, the house held its breath. They opened the box. The vest was gray, heavy, and unassuming. To a stranger, it looked like a piece of exercise equipment. To them, it looked like peace. Cassie watched as her mother gently helped Leo into it. He was having a hard afternoon, his hands flapping, a low hum of distress vibrating in his throat. As the weight of the vest settled onto his shoulders, something miraculous happened. The humming stopped. His shoulders dropped. He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up, his eyes focusing. "Squeeze," he whispered. "It's a squeeze," Cassie said softly. Leo closed his eyes and leaned back against the couch, finally, blissfully still. Watching him, Cassie realized the true depth of what William had taught her. It wasn't about marketing. It wasn't about the why being a sales tactic. It was about the fact that her love for her brother was powerful enough to move strangers. She hadn't manipulated those people. She had invited them to share in this moment of peace. She had bridged the gap between her isolated struggle and the world. The $7 was gone, replaced by a vest, but what she had kept was far more valuable. The knowledge that she was strong enough to save herself. 3 weeks later, the season had finally turned. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of dried leaves and wood smoke, signaling the summer was over. Cassie walked past the daily grind on her way home from school. She slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the glass window for the sharp silhouette of a man in a charcoal suit. She looked for the gray eyes that had dissected her failure and handed her back a strategy. But the table in the corner was empty. William wasn't there, and perhaps he never would be again. In a movie, this is where she would run in and thank him. She would tell him that Leo was sleeping through the night, that the deep purple circles under her mother's eyes were fading, and that the house wasn't holding its breath anymore. But life isn't a movie. It is a series of quiet shifts that happen when we aren't looking. She realized, standing on that sidewalk with her backpack slung over one shoulder, that she didn't need to find him. He hadn't been a savior. He had been a mirror. He had forced her to look at herself not as a victim of circumstance, but as an agent of change. He had shown her that her voice was a tool she had simply forgotten how to use. The $7.42 was long gone. It had been absorbed into the purchase of the vest, just numbers on a digital receipt. But the currency she had actually earned that day was still in her pocket, heavy and permanent. It was the knowledge that she could face the world. She had walked into the fire of public judgment, that terrifying, exposed place where strangers can look at your pain, and she hadn't burned up. She had forged a connection. She had traded her pride for something far more durable, the realization that she was capable of impacting her own reality, no matter how small she felt. She understood now that the silence she had tried so hard to maintain was never dignity. It was fear. True dignity was the courage to say, "This is hard, and I need help," and to trust that the world was big enough to hold that truth. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the coffee shop. She didn't look like the scared girl hiding a shoebox anymore. She looked like someone who knew her own name. Back at home, the dynamic had shifted. It wasn't just about the vest calming Leo. It was about Cassie calming herself. She sat at the kitchen table that evening, not wringing her hands over bills she couldn't pay, but laying out a new set of stones. She wasn't painting them with the frantic energy of desperation this time. She was painting with focus. She was planning a craft fair at the school, organizing other students to raise money for the special education department. She wasn't asking for permission. She was building a platform. She was taking the lesson William gave her and expanding it, proving that one small act of courage can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. She picked up a brush, dipping it into a pot of bright yellow paint. She carefully traced the line of a sunburst, the yellow bright against the dark river stone. Her hand was steady. The fear was still there, somewhere deep down, the fear of rejection, the fear of not being enough. That never really goes away. But she knew how to talk to it now. She knew that vulnerability wasn't a crack in the armor, it was the way the light got in. She had truly saved herself, not by becoming harder, but by becoming real. And that is a lesson that echoes far longer than any coin can ring. Cassie learned that hiding your own struggle doesn't make you strong, it just makes you lonely. Strength is found when you brave the shame to speak your truth, turning a private burden into a shared connection. If this story reminded us of the quiet resilience of a young heart, please share it to inspire someone else. Subscribe to Girlhood Tales for more stories about finding your voice.